Some of the most dangerous inmates in America will never step inside ADX Florence, even when they clearly meet the criteria. Not because they're safe, not because they've changed, but because sending them there could actually make things worse. And in some cases, the system itself refuses to take that risk. Before we continue, kindly subscribe for more documentary. At first glance, the logic behind America's most secure prisons seems simple. The worst offenders go to the most secure place. ADX Florence was built for total control. Isolation, silence, no communication, no influence, no movement without permission. So you would expect that every high-risk, violent, or uncontrollable inmate ends up there. But that's not how it works. In reality, there are inmates considered too dangerous for normal prisons, yet still never transferred to ADX. That contradiction isn't random. It's deliberate, because ADX isn't just a punishment facility. It's a highly controlled system with very specific limits. And not every dangerous inmate fits inside those limits. One of the biggest reasons comes down to mental health. Over the years, multiple court cases exposed a serious issue. Placing severely mentally ill inmates in extreme isolation often made them worse. Not unstable, not difficult. Worse in a way that became uncontrollable. Some inmates began experiencing severe psychological breakdowns, hallucinations, self-harm, complete detachment from reality. In a place designed for control, that kind of instability creates the opposite effect. It becomes unpredictable. And unpredictability inside a supermax environment is a problem the system tries to avoid. That's why, in several cases, inmates who committed violent acts inside prison were still not sent to ADX. Instead, they were kept in specialized units or transferred to facilities with mental health programs. Not because they were less dangerous, but because ADX was not equipped to manage that kind of danger. Another reason is intelligence value. Some inmates are deeply connected to organized crime, terrorism networks, or gangs operating both inside and outside prison. At first, it might seem logical to isolate them completely, but total isolation cuts off communication, and with it, valuable information. For federal agencies, that's a trade-off. Sending certain inmates to ADX could mean losing ongoing intelligence about criminal operations. So instead of isolating them completely, they're sometimes placed in high-security units where limited monitoring is possible. Controlled communication becomes a tool. And in those cases, control matters more than silence. Then there's the issue of control itself. ADX is built for inmates who can follow structure, even if that structure is extremely strict. But some inmates don't respond to structure at all. They resist it. They escalate. There have been documented cases where inmates transferred to high-security environments became more aggressive, more disruptive, and harder to manage. Not less. For prison officials, that creates a difficult question. What happens when the most controlled environment fails to control? Because once an inmate is inside ADX, options become limited. Movement is restricted. Interaction is minimal. Intervention is harder. If behavior escalates inside that system, managing it becomes even more complex than in other facilities. So in some cases, officials decide not to send certain inmates there at all. Not because ADX is too harsh, but because it might not work. And when it doesn't work, the consequences are harder to contain. There's also a legal dimension that changed everything. Over time, lawsuits challenged how inmates, especially those with mental illness, were being held in extreme isolation. Courts began to question whether long-term solitary confinement violated basic human rights. These weren't small claims. They forced the federal system to reassess who should and shouldn't be placed in ADX. As a result, stricter criteria were introduced. Not every violent inmate qualified anymore. There had to be clear justification that ADX placement would improve security, not create new problems. That shift quietly changed the system, and it created a category of inmates who are considered extremely dangerous, but still remain outside ADX. Because the goal is no longer just punishment, it's control. And sometimes, the most secure prison in America isn't the best place to achieve that. But that raises a deeper question. If ADX isn't the final solution for every dangerous inmate, then what happens to the ones who don't go there? And more importantly, where do you put someone the system itself can't fully control? For the inmates who never make it to ADX, the system doesn't relax. It adapts, because these individuals are still considered high risk, sometimes even more unpredictable than those already inside the most secure prison in the country. Instead of one solution, the system creates layers, different facilities, different units, different rules, all designed around one question: how do you contain someone without losing control completely? One of the primary alternatives is the use of special management units, often called SMUs. These units exist inside high-security federal prisons, but they operate under tighter restrictions than general population. Inmates placed there are often involved in repeated violence, gang coordination, or ongoing disruption. But unlike ADX, SMUs allow limited interaction. And that difference matters, because interaction, however controlled, gives prison staff more opportunities to monitor behavior, gather intelligence, and intervene when necessary. It's not about comfort. It's about flexibility. Another option involves specialized mental health facilities. For inmates whose behavior is driven by severe psychological conditions, isolation alone doesn't solve the problem. In fact, it can make it worse. So instead of sending them to ADX, they are transferred to federal medical centers or units designed to handle psychiatric care within a secure environment. These places are still prisons, still controlled, but they are built to stabilize, not just isolate. And that distinction can determine whether an inmate becomes more manageable or completely uncontainable. There's also a group of inmates who remain in high-security penitentiaries under constant surveillance. They're not in ADX, but they're watched closely, every movement tracked, every interaction recorded. In some cases, they are placed under administrative detention, where they are separated from the general population but still remain within the facility. This allows officials to adjust conditions quickly, increase restrictions when needed, ease them when behavior stabilizes, something that's far harder to do inside ADX. Then there's a less visible factor: resources. ADX is designed for extreme cases, but it has limited capacity. Not every dangerous inmate can be sent there, even if they qualify. So decisions are made carefully. Priority is given to those who present the most consistent, controllable threat within the ADX structure. Not necessarily the most chaotic, because chaos doesn't always translate well inside a system built on strict predictability. But even with all these alternatives, the system still faces a problem it hasn't fully solved. Some inmates don't fit anywhere. They're too violent for standard high-security units, too unstable for isolation, too influential to cut off completely, and too unpredictable to manage with traditional methods. These are the cases that expose the limits of the system. There have been documented instances where inmates cycle through multiple facilities, each one trying a different approach. Transfer after transfer, restriction after restriction, and still the behavior continues. At that point, the goal shifts. It's no longer about finding the perfect placement. It's about minimizing damage, containing risk, preventing escalation, because full control may not be possible. This reality forces a difficult admission. The prison system, even at its highest level, is not built to handle every type of danger perfectly. ADX represents the peak of control, but it's still a controlled environment with boundaries. And some individuals operate outside those boundaries. That's why decisions about placement are rarely simple. They involve security assessments, psychological evaluations, intelligence considerations, and legal constraints all at once. It's not just about what an inmate has done. It's about what might happen next. And sometimes, sending someone to the most secure prison in America doesn't reduce that risk. It increases it. That's the part most people never see. The system isn't just trying to punish. It's trying to manage something that doesn't always follow rules. And when it fails to find the right solution, the consequences don't stay inside prison walls. They ripple outward into other facilities, into the system itself, and sometimes into the public. Because when control breaks down at that level, it doesn't happen quietly. Forces change, policy shifts, new restrictions, new legal battles. and each one reveals the same uncomfortable truth. Maximum security has limits, and not every threat can be locked behind a single door.